So your toilet's acting up and it's not flushing very well for you, or it's running all the time, squealing and squeaking, not filling, overfilling, filling very slow, water's just going everywhere. We've modified a toilet just so that we can show you this. These arms can slide out and in, and you can actually pull it completely apart. If you put a wrench on it, you can crack it. I'm Mitch with Smedley Plumbing, and we're gonna show you how to fix most of your common toilet problems. When we flush the toilet, we see all the water leaves the bowl, it flushes out the bottom, and then we're gonna refill. This is the standard cycle of a toilet. There's really three components inside the toilet tank. You have a flapper, a fill valve, and then you have what's called a flush valve. One of the most common things that we get would be called like a phantom flush. What it is the flapper is leaking. And if the flapper leaks, the water will slowly leave the tank. And then what you're hearing is the fill valve coming on in an instant to refill that tank. One of the ways that you can identify this in your home, just go to your kitchen cabinet and take some food coloring and put a couple of drops of food coloring in the tank. Get the tank to be a nice blue or red or green color. And then if you look in the bowl, after an hour or so, if the color from the tank has now appeared in the bowl and nobody's used the toilet, that usually means you need a new flapper. Another condition that we can have is the flapper will get stuck in the up position. It's never overfilling, it's just never filling at all. So that's a fairly common issue that we can run into as well. One of the final issues that we can run into is when your flapper gets really old and really corroded and really just worn out, the flappers cannot function at all. And when you go to flush it, it like partially flushes or half flushes, or you have to hold the lever down. That's usually the signs of a flapper that's beyond its usable life. And so we need to replace the flapper in those cases. Let's also talk about some other issues where the toilet's running nonstop and it won't shut off. That's typically gonna be a fill valve related issue. If I hold this down, I can simulate a fill valve not shutting off, and the water comes up over the top of the overflow tube in there, and the water just keeps coming up over the top and coming up over the top and coming up over the top. We've arrived to many toilets that are doing this right here. That's typically a bad fill valve. We need to replace the fill valve. It can even be sticking in the off position. That's actually kind of a bad one to have. If it's gonna take 30 minutes to refill the tank, somebody else comes in there to use the toilet and the tank only has half the water that it's supposed to, then if they flush it, you can actually clog your toilet because you did a partial flush instead of a complete flush. Not filling, overfilling, filling very slow, and then if it's making a bunch of noise while it's filling. And then the fifth would be it just breaks and water's just going everywhere. That happens too. So those are really about the 5 failures you get with these fill valves. And a long time ago, we used to rebuild them and we used to worry about, not replacing it, just rebuilding it. But nowadays, fill valves are cheap enough and it's easy enough to replace them. We don't even mess with trying to rebuild them. We just replace them because ultimately you can't beat new. We're gonna let this refill. We're gonna dump our bucket of water that's underneath this toilet, and then we're gonna dive in and show you how to do some of these repairs. And we're also gonna simulate how some of these things happen. This is about the rate of a typical failed flapper would be. They seep a little bit and they seep a little bit. It's all being very quiet when it's doing this. Here any second, you're gonna hear the toilet just start refilling. Right there. That's what gets nicknamed the phantom flush, and ultimately it's from a bad seal on the flapper. To replace a flapper, you can do this 2 ways. If your shutoff is good and you're confident that your shutoff is gonna work, you can turn it off here. You can replace the flapper without shutting off the water. You're gonna have water running through the tank, but it's just gonna go right down the tank. It's gonna waste a little bit of water, but that's probably okay. If you don't have confidence in that shutoff, maybe you can find your main water shutoff in the house and you can turn it off there. Either which is fine. This is the better way to do it. If you are gonna use it, just isolate the one fixture instead of the whole house. Let's do another flush. The flapper is typically clipped or wrapped around these 2 arms on the flush valve assembly. And if those arms break, you now have to replace the flush valve assembly. That's not a cheap repair. So a lot of times what I do is I'll grab a pair of snips and I'll actually cut the flapper free instead of trying to unclip it from those arms. When you cut there, it's just gonna come right off, but it's gonna do it in a way that makes sure we don't damage the arms. This flapper's ruined anyway. It's no big deal that we're cutting up something that we're gonna replace. For most of your standard toilets that use a flapper, they're either gonna use a 2-inch or a 3-inch flapper. It's pretty easy to tell the difference between the two. If you go to your local hardware store, they're gonna have 2-inch and 3-inch flappers there. If you're really super worried about it, you just buy them both and then return the one you don't use. For 3-inch flappers, I like using the Fluidmaster universal flapper. It seems to be the most versatile for all of the different types of setups we encounter in the field. For a 2-inch flapper, I like using the Korkey universal 2-inch flapper. You see them come where they're separated at the bottom, and then you'll see them come where they're connected with a ring in between them. That ring is like your last ditch effort. If you were to break the arms off of the flush valve, then the idea is you can run that ring down around the flush valve, and it kind of works. Flappers are not anything crazy expensive. This particular one uses a 3-inch, so we're not gonna use the 2-inch flapper. The same logic applies. However, you are gonna see a little bit more steps involved with the 3-inch, so that's why we're good to show you that one. With this universal flapper kit, you get a couple of forms of adjustability with these flappers. These arms can slide out and in, and they even give you little A and B settings on there as to where the arms should be. If you want to know where they need to be on your toilet, all you have to do is line up where your arms are. You don't even have to measure it, you just hold them up next to each other. Another realm of adjustability with these is the distance between the center of the flapper and the pivot point. They include different arms that are gonna be a slightly different distance. This is the most common distance, so you probably won't need to use these pieces, but you might. Really, all we find that we have to do is just change the width out in the field. The last thing that you would be able to adjust on these is going to be the timing of the flapper. A lot of flappers have an air bubble underneath them. And what that air bubble is for is when they open, the air bubble traps air and lets it float until the water level in the tank gets down low enough for it to fall. You can actually adjust how fast the air escapes from the air bubble. Essentially, you can make the flapper close sooner. I don't like any air escaping the flapper. I want the flapper open as long as possible. Toilets already don't use enough water to keep your drain system clear. We never want to short how much water a toilet is using. This one is already set from the factory to stay open as long as possible. We're gonna leave it that way. When it comes to installing your new flapper, the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna clip it down onto the 2 arms of the flush valve. And then we're gonna adjust the chain. So basically we've set the flapper over the hole, and then now all we have to do is just snap it down over the arms. Before we hook the chain up, we can just check and ensure that it does move freely. One of the most important parts when you're rebuilding a toilet is how tight is your chain. If it's too loose, all your chain slack is taken up in the travel of the toilet lever. If it's too tight, then your flapper actually risks not closing all of the way, and you're right back into a running toilet scenario. I like to measure it for a perfect length, and then I add about a 1/2 inch of chain length. So we go ahead and take the hook off of the chain. I'm gonna hold the hook about where it would be on the toilet lever, and then I'm gonna measure with my thumb on the chain where that would need to be. This very well might be something that you need to do 2 or 3 times. You might get it set up, and then you check it, and it's a little tight. And so you need to adjust it. And then you check it again and it's a little loose, so you need to adjust it again. But there we've got a nice little bit of slack, but it's still available to lift the flapper all of the way. That's what we want. Here's a really key piece, a really important piece. This extra bit of chain that's in here. We can either use a pair of pliers and cut the excess off, or we can loop it back over the hook so that it is half as long as it once was. For the sake of this video, I'm just gonna loop it back over the hook. When I'm in a customer's home, I typically cut the excess off so it's not a non-issue. The problem that you can have if you have a lot of extra chain slack, it can actually get under the flapper and cause your brand new flapper to leak just because there's enough slack to do so. That's not really the case here, but we still want it up and out of the way. Now our chain slack is out of the way and our flapper is in and good. We can turn our water back on. It's gonna take a while for this to fill, but then we can make sure that everything is set properly. That's gonna ensure that our flapper is in the right position and it's not defective from the factory or anything else. And just make sure that this water level doesn't drop and we don't get another one of those phantom refills. So we've waited long enough, we know it's holding water really well. Let's go ahead and give it one flush and just make sure it's gonna cycle well, and then we can move on to the fill valve. To replace the fill valve, you are gonna have to shut your water off to the fixture. The next thing we wanna do is flush the toilet and get rid of most of the water in the tank. Next up, what we need to do is we need to remove the supply line to the toilet, and then we actually need to take out the fill valve. Now, there's probably a little bit of water left in the tank. Very rarely when you flush it will it get all the water out. You have a couple of options there. One is you can take a sponge and just dip it down into that water, let it soak the water up, and then wring it out into a bucket or something like that. Another option is you can just start taking out the fill valve and have a bucket underneath the toilet here to catch the water. Or a third option is you use what we use as plumbers. So I use this little tool called the last drop, and it's basically just kind of like a little sucker gun. It allows me to stick this down into the tank and suck the water out, and after a couple of cycles of this, the water is out. Some of our other plumbers will actually use a shop vac. They take the filter out of the shop vac, and then they just put their shop vac down in there and suck all the water out. You could do that too. If you have a shop vac at your house, just make sure you take the filter off, because you don't want to be sucking water out with a filter in there. And all that slurping noise tells us we got most of the water out of there. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to remove the supply line from the fill valve. Some of these supply lines are just on hand tight. Some of them will require a pair of pliers to get off. Whenever you're putting a supply line back on, you want to be very cautious with how much you tighten it. We will need a pair of pliers to get the nut off the bottom of the tank that holds the fill valve on. I know it can be kind of confusing. It's righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. If you grab your pliers and you push your pliers towards the wall, that is going to loosen the nut. This one is just hand tight, so we're gonna get that off of there. We might get a little bit of water dribbling out of there. It's not too big of a deal. If you've got a towel, go ahead and set it on the floor under the left side of the toilet. Every one of these fill valves is a little bit different. This particular one had an extra little ring and washer on the bottom of it, but ultimately the fill valve is out, so we can get to putting in our new fill valve. Let's show you how we do that. Here we have a Fluidmaster 400A. This is kind of one of the gold standards of fill valves for a homeowner to use. They do make one that's slightly better than this, that has a brass threaded shank on the bottom of it. To be honest with you, I don't know why they make that one. I've put them in both for years. I've never seen the shank of a fill valve break, so I don't know why they really felt compelled that one needed to be brass, but it is what it is. Take your pick, they both work perfectly. In our box here, we have a baggie of parts. Let's go ahead and open that up. We have our fill valve assembly, and it's already got the rubber washer on the bottom of it. Sometimes these don't have the rubber washer already attached to the bottom. Sometimes it comes with the rubber washer separate, and you actually have to punch out a little mushroom piece of rubber to put the washer on. If you're at that point in this video, you need to refer to those instructions, have at it. Here is our nut that's going to fasten it to the tank. And then we have a new overflow tube or rinsing tube. This is what helps rinse the bowl and refill the bowl to make sure it's all the way back full. And then we have a new clip. First thing we want to do is we want to kind of measure off to the side of the tank about where, so you can use your thumb and pick up this plunger. You want to kind of get it somewhat set to where it's halfway close on the water level height. That is going to be something we have to set once we get this installed. These fill valves, they're adjustable. And if I spin this and pull, there we go. You can actually pull it completely apart, but you can adjust the height of it. If we've got a really tall tank that holds a lot of water, we need it way up here. If we've got a really short tank that doesn't hold very much water, we need it way down here. And then most important thing with setting the height on this is make sure that this collar goes all the way back down. Without this collar on there, if you didn't slide that collar on there, as soon as you turn on the water, this thing launches off the top and you flood your house. We don't want that. Once we get it close, the final adjustments happen on this screw shaft here. There's a little nozzle here off to the side of it. This is where water comes out to refill the bowl. We want to make sure this nozzle is pointed at the overflow tube. We drop it in there, nozzle's pointed at the overflow tube. Now we can put our nut back on the bottom. This ring does not have flat sides on it. It's not designed for you to put a wrench on. It's got these two wing handles on there. So when you're getting it up there and tight, it's designed to only be hand tight. Now that we have that on there, we're gonna go ahead and put our supply line back on there. And again, if you'll notice on the supply line, it's got 3 wings on it. There are no flat sides on it. This is also one of the things that's not designed to have a wrench put on it. If you put a wrench on it, you can crack it. There's been a lot of houses that get flooded from over-tightened supply lines, and that nut cracks. And it won't do it right away. It'll do it in a year or 2. Next up is the rinsing tube or the refill tube. So when you flush a toilet, all the water that goes down out of the flapper clears the bowl really well, but then it leaves your bowl not all the way full. So this tube actually connects to the nozzle on the side of the fill valve and runs water down the overflow tube to help make sure the bowl is all the way full. Fluidmaster sells a couple of these that have these real gimmicky things on them that pinch this tube off, trying to tell you to conserve water. I've been a plumber for 20 years and I've watched the water conservation methods come across. We can only get so green before we're no longer doing the job. And one thing that we've seen time and time again is people are having more and more drain clogs now because we're trying to save water. And when it really comes down to it, water's cheap. And so here we are saving 50 cents or $1 worth of water every month, and then we get a drain clog that costs us a couple $100 and maybe some water damage. If it has one on there, set it to where it's flowing wide open. On the overflow tube in the tank, we want to take this cap off the top of it. This cap was for the old fill valve. The new fill valve uses this special clip. We're gonna go ahead and push the hose onto the nozzle. We get it pushed all the way on there, and then this clip is set to where it's just gonna run right down the side of that, and it directs the hose right into the overflow tube. There's a lot of wives' tales out there that talk about take this and point it outside the tank. It makes the tank refill faster. And again, the basis for all of that is conserving water. Another problem with that is it does not allow the bowl to get all the way refilled. If your bowl's not all the way refilled, your toilet will not flush properly. It's better to waste a little bit of extra water while the toilet's refilling than it is to deal with any of the problems that can come from that. Next thing we need to do is we need to hook the other side of this tube up to the nozzle. In this particular application, I don't need to trim any of this tube off. If the tank lid was lower or all of this assembly was higher, maybe there is too much here and I do need to trim that off. Sometimes these overflow tubes, they're on the other side of the flush valve, so now it's really close to the fill valve. Maybe I need to trim it off there. You can get a pair of pliers or a pair of scissors or a pair of snips and trim this tube off. In this case, we don't need to. So we're just gonna hook it right up to the nozzle. And then one last thing that I always do for good measure, and it's because I'm paranoid about flooding a house, I always give the fill valve a tug to make sure I can't pull it off. We can turn the water back on now, and now we're gonna have to set the water level. It's not gonna be accurate, we know that. It's never accurate right out of the gate. So we're gonna go ahead and let it fill and do what it needs to do, and then we're gonna show you how to set the water level. You can actually see water coming out of the rinsing tube or the overflow tube. That water is going straight into the bowl, and here in a second or two, you're actually gonna see it trickle out the bottom of the toilet. And that's just that little bit of extra water that we're wasting. And again, we're not talking maybe a few ounces of water every flush. It's not really worth trying to put devices on this rinsing tube to save that couple of ounces of water. So we were fairly close with our adjustment out of the gate, but we can make our final adjustments by turning this knob on the shaft that runs down the side of the fill valve. When I turn this knob counterclockwise, it lowers the float and therefore it lowers the water level in the tank. If I turn the knob clockwise, it'll raise the float. If you're at the end of the threads and you're still not where you want to be, then you need to actually pull that collar up and make some manual adjustments on the length of the shaft. And again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the water level right to the indicator line on the fill valve, or on the flush valve, I mean. Boom, right on it. The first adjustment we made worked. Maybe that's a benefit of having 20 years of experience. If it takes you 2 or 3 times, don't feel bad. I end up getting the shaft length wrong initially, and I've got to turn the water off and adjust that. And if you do have that shaft length wrong, make sure you turn the water off before you start adjusting it. If the water is on and that valve is pressurized and you pull that collar up, that valve can split apart and shoot water everywhere. So we don't want to do that. But that pretty much completes the video for how to rebuild your toilet. If you have any questions at all, we love making these videos for you guys, and we love bringing you plumbing videos in a way you've never seen them before. If you have any questions, if this sparked any interest, or you have questions about how to fix your toilet, drop them in the comments. We are very active on this channel, and we love to answer your questions. Do not hesitate to ask, and until next time, we will see you guys later.